Hello, and welcome to The Mind of a Therapist, a podcast where I interview psychotherapists and helping professionals in what they're passionate about in order to provide you with messages of encouragement and hope. I'm your host, Andrew Earl. The Mind of a Therapist is sponsored by Psychological Counseling Services, healing hearts and transforming lives. Look into our intensive at pcsearl.com. In today's interview, I interview Ben Fineman and Carolyn Wiita. Ben is a psychotherapist in Los Angeles who helps young professionals and entrepreneurs find a greater sense of personal fulfillment in life. He spends much of his free time researching what makes counseling work and thinking about how to promote a complete overhaul of the psychotherapy field. Carolyn is a marriage and family therapist trainee in Los Angeles. She also runs MFT California, an online catalog of marriage and family therapy programs in California, and offers personal coaching through her blog by Happenchance for anyone thinking about becoming an MFT. So without further ado, here's my interview with Ben and Carrie. All right, well, Carrie and Ben, welcome to the podcast today. This is the first podcast on The Mind of a Therapist where there's two interviewees, so congratulations on the Mind of a Therapist first. So for those who don't know, Ben and Carrie started a podcast called The Very Bad Therapy Podcast, and that's how I connected with you two. I was really attracted to the name at first. It's, very, very engaging.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've since I listened to initially was caught by the name, I've really been drawn to the conversations you two have been having and how you've really highlighted the voices of clients, and really a lot of, interviewing Scott Miller, a lot of your interviews really center around honoring clients. So I've been really appreciative of your work. And I was interested to maybe start off, like, how did you two come to start this podcast?
Well, we're going to try to not talk over each other this whole thing. So we have a complicated system of hand signals that kind of gesture when one of us is going to start talking.
Nice.
So Ben, let me know if you want to jump in here. He's giving me the thumbs up, which means I can keep talking. So we actually met. We were both fans. We didn't know each other. We were fans of another podcast called the Modern Therapist Survival Guide podcast. That's hosted by Kurt Whithelm and Katie Vernoy. And we had both started listening when we were both in our first years of graduate school. And we just happened to both have reached out to Kurt Whithelm with questions. And he had said, why don't you come meet me for coffee? This was pre-COVID, obviously, when we could see people in person at coffee shops. And so I had a meeting with him, and I went and I had a great chat with him. And then he, towards the end was like, I'm sorry, but I have another meeting right after you, so you need to go now. I was like, okay. So I got up to leave, and on my way out, this other person walked up, and Kurt's like, oh, this is my other meeting. And it was Ben. And Ben introduced himself and said, you want to grab coffee or lunch sometime? And I said, sure, would love to. And we started hanging out. We'd get together because we were at different graduate programs. And so we would get together and start having conversations about questions we had about what we were learning and what we were reading. And it turned out that we were both very interested in the same things, the same ideas in the field, and had both also noticed that we weren't hearing about these ideas in our graduate programs. So those were the conversations that we had first. And then at a certain point, Ben, if you want to pick it up, how the podcast came to be.
Sure. So I had read a book called The Heart and Soul of Change, which was co-edited by Scott Miller, who, Andrew, I know you've spoken with and you're a fan of his work. Mm-hmm. And it's just chock full of information about what makes therapy work. And it isn't always intuitive. And the things we learn in graduate school sometimes contradicts what the data actually says on how therapists get better over time, what works in therapy, all of the things that I think should be the most important questions that we're asking ourselves as we prepare to start working with clients, which is where Kara and I were in our journey when we had first met, was getting ready to start seeing clients for the first time. And so we started talking, and as she said, we were curious why it seemed like these things weren't being addressed in our graduate programs. Specifically, what should we be doing as new therapists to make sure that we're actually getting better as we progress? Because surprisingly, you don't get better just as a function of experience as a therapist. There's more than enough data to confirm that on average, somebody with decades of experience is just as good as the three of us are with probably a combined like 7 years of experience, right? And it started to frustrate both of us that these conversations didn't seem to exist. Not only what can we do to get better as therapists, but what do clients actually think of the experience of therapy? It was such a one-sided introduction to the field. You have people who are experts in their sort of respective corner of the psychotherapy world telling you how to do psychotherapy perfectly. And yet if we're not getting better over time individually or as a field, right? The outcome studies show that we're not actually getting better year to year. Like going back to the 70s, we're just as effective as a whole. It seems like we're missing a big piece of the puzzle. And for Carrie and I, it seemed like that was largely what happens when therapy doesn't go well, because we hear more than enough about how to do therapy right. What is good therapy? That is what we learn in grad school and training and supervision. We couldn't find an outlet where people were saying, what is bad therapy? How can we avoid it? And how can we learn from our collective mistakes as a field? And so since we couldn't find those conversations anywhere, we figured we would just create them ourselves.
Awesome. I love it. And
Yeah.
I'm really curious. I just thought I'd love to hear maybe a story from each of you with like your collective knowledge at this point of these bad experiences in therapy. Maybe some that have just stood out to you that maybe have informed your work or you're just really surprised by. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to draw from. I think for me, the thing that has been the most impactful in terms of influencing my work or what I strive to be aware of in doing therapy is actually more of like a collective kind of theme that seems to have come out of all of the stories. And I mean, we've heard like over 60, I think, stories at this point, conversations. And the something that keeps coming up over and over again in different permutations, different contexts, but a lot of harm happens when something doesn't go quite right for the client. The client hasn't experienced something about the therapy is not quite right. And in trying to bring it up or address it in the room, when the therapist responds with defensiveness, it shuts therapy down, and it can be super damaging for the client in a lot of different ways. It shows up, there's a lot of different consequences, but it seems to be the connective tissue that when a therapist can't hear that they're doing something wrong, refuses to believe that what they're doing is wrong, or just overrides or ignores the client. How it ends up bad is there's a variety of ways. We've heard from clients who felt often turn it back on themselves and then think that they must have done something wrong, that their perception of this must have been wrong, they must have been in the wrong the entire time, or they feel like they shouldn't have said anything, or sometimes they know that it's wrong, they know the experience wasn't good for them, and they just don't go back to therapy. And we hear a lot of times from clients saying after that, it took me years before I would go back to therapy because the experience has been so damaging. So for me, that is the thing that I've really tried to be aware of, is how, for me as a therapist, does defensiveness come up? What does it look like? Under what circumstances am I more prone to become defensive? And try to head that off at the pass.
Yeah. How about you, Ben?
I agree with everything Carrie said, but the thought that popped into my head in terms of what stood out to me was just one anecdotal story that I don't think happens too often, but I think it speaks to something bigger. So the very short version is we heard from a gay man whose therapist suggested that he urinate in a cup so she could test to see whether he was actually gay. And this
Really?
this happened in the 2010s, not the 1940s. Now, there is, of course, a rich, bizarre backstory to this. None of it justifies such a bizarre intervention. And I think it speaks to, like, therapists can do amazing work by just doing less. Like, we are not rocket scientists trying to, like, find the one precise, perfect intervention, as bizarre as it may be, that will unlock some definition of therapeutic success. Therapy is simultaneously incredibly complex and incredibly simple, right? Human relationships are always complex, but it is still just a human relationship. And I think we hear some stories where you stop and you wonder, and you're like, man, what happened to just relating to somebody as a human being? Like, we don't have to go so far above and beyond where we forget that this is just a human being in front of us. And by simply listening and caring and talking, 95%, I shouldn't just slap a number on it, but some giant percentage of what makes therapy work happens in that moment of just human relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And from the episodes I've listened to of the Very Bad Therapy podcast, I know you've touched on that a number of times, of that, the therapeutic alliance and the therapeutic relationship. And yeah, I'm wondering what sort of thoughts you two have. And Carrie, you mentioned there, like making sure to stay clear, or recognizing defensiveness when it comes up, and then staying clear of that defensive posture. And then Ben, you're talking about relating to people just as like a human being, just really being present with them relationally. I'm wondering what other ideas you two have about how to really nurture that therapeutic alliance and the therapeutic relationship.
I mean, I think the standout for both of us, and this is kind of what bonded us together in the beginning, was for both of us, routine outcome monitoring and feedback informed treatment seemed like a no-brainer. It seemed like this obvious way to check in with clients and find out what's working and what isn't in therapy, and tailoring your treatment as you go along to fit the client. And it was given kind of lip service coverage in my graduate program. Ben, I'm not even sure if they even talked about it in your program, but
yeah, like half of one class on assessments and psych testing.
Yeah. And we, in our conversations outside of our program, kind of felt like, this seems obvious. Why is this not more widespread? Why is this not implemented across the board? And I think that what's interesting is something that does come up in several conversations with our guests. We ask questions like, what could a therapist have done? What could that therapist have done in the situation to make it better? And almost uniformly, they agree that if there had been more of an established culture in the room of the therapist saying, I might not be doing it right. There may be another answer here. I want your feedback. I'm looking for what you think is working and what you think isn't working.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the structure of routine outcome monitoring provides this established place over time that puts a primacy on the client's opinion about what is happening over and above what the therapist thinks should be happening. So for me, that's really what has struck me.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I would add to that as a therapist, you are going to fail, and you are going to fail repeatedly, no matter how good you are, no matter how much you care, no matter how much you embrace being a good therapist as part of your identity. The nature of therapy is that sometimes it doesn't work for clients, and sometimes it's about 5 to 10% clients actually feel worse when they're done with therapy compared to when they came in. And it's not that because we don't acknowledge that this happens, it goes away. It's that it sort of exists either in denial or shame or unawareness that it does happen. And so it needs to be okay for us as a field, even at the very early stages of our career, to talk about, hey, I actually think I kind of did a bad job here. My client left. They told me it wasn't helpful. And it doesn't mean that the client is being resistant. It doesn't mean that the client, quote unquote, isn't ready for therapy. There is always room for us to reflect inward and say, what could I have done better? And that's where growth happens, is through that personal reflection, that engagement with where are my growth edges, and then practicing deliberately to improve your skills as a clinician. And I think so much of the culture of psychotherapy is that we want to be experts. And so many of us, not Carrie, we've talked about this extensively elsewhere, but so many of us feel this imposter syndrome. Like our peers and our clients are going to find out that we don't know what we're doing. I say, good. We don't know what we're doing. Each client is different. This is not a formulaic process. Embrace the fact that you might not know what you're doing and use that generatively so that when you feel like you might not be helping your client, you have the capacity to check in and be open to getting feedback that might confirm that. Because whether or not you do, they're still not getting helped in those moments. And that's okay. It's inevitable with some clients. It's about what you do when that happens that defines you as a therapist, not whether or not, you're open to the idea of failure.
Yeah, well, really drawn to what you two were saying there, and there's a number of things that caught my attention. One thing that I thought of, I think you two have interviewed Chris Hoff with the Radical Therapist, and yeah, his work has really resonated with me. He actually presented at a conference and talked about what you're talking about there he actually had a video of him failing and then like you said, what do you do with those failures, right? Do you step into that defensiveness and this is how we should proceed, or are you receptive to what the person consulting you is saying? And I think that's just so important for any relationship.
For sure.
And yeah, especially within the context of psychotherapy, though, acknowledging the mistakes you make and how healing that can be for you to do rather than labeling the client as resistant, right? I think so many people who are coming to consult us really contend with a lot of judgment. I'm grounded in narrative therapy and based in the work of Foucault, who says the operations of modern power are really like the normalization of judgment, so for that, I think so often we replicate what is problematic in these psychotherapeutic theories, and I think that this posture is so counter to the replication of that judgment.
Yeah. And to illustrate what we're talking about, Carrie and I mean, we've heard this from our guests on the show, but we get just as many, if not more, emails from people who aren't necessarily looking to share their experience, but they've had bad experiences in therapy and had no idea that this was a thing that other people experience until they came across our podcast and found such a sense of relief in knowing that A, they're not alone, and B, it doesn't mean that they did something wrong, because this can happen. And because of the power structures in society, we don't always question expertise. I mean, we're not doing great right now in listening to science and listening to the experts who should be listened to. But it is counterintuitive for people to challenge a therapist. We've interviewed therapists who were clients themselves and had a bad experience. They are in the field and they found it hard to confront their therapist about something that was problematic for them. And so these power structures, you can't get rid of them. You can only try and make them as transparent as possible. And when therapists don't do that alongside with confronting the realities of failure, it is solely left for the clients to hold and try and make sense of. Mm-hmm. And like you said, Andrew, that's just kind of reinforcing external power dynamics where, as the quote unquote experts, as the people with power in this relationship, we're not to be questioned. Mm-hmm. And I think that's bullshit.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I think something else that we've really kind of been growing more aware of lately is how much, what an impact it has that the clients often will come into the room with that expectation. With the expectation that you are the expert, that you do know what's going on. And I think to a lot of therapists, that can be very unsettling because you are told through graduate school, right? Like depending on your program, certainly, and depending on your theoretical orientation, but I think most modern therapist training programs tend to emphasize a collaborative approach, a more equal, a one down therapist position. And so we are told, you don't give your clients advice. You don't fix your clients. You don't tell them what to do. Whereas clients will often come into the room being like, tell me what to do. It is time. I am paying you as a professional to tell me what to do. Or maybe it's not that explicit, but it's a general kind of posture or approach of, I don't know what I'm doing in my life. I'm here because I think you will be able to help me. And I think for a lot of therapists, that's deeply unsettling because suddenly they're in a chair across from someone who's expecting them to do something right. And for therapists, I think it can be like identity dissolving to be told from a client, I'm here for help and you're not helping me right. You're not doing it right. And this is where I think the defensiveness is so dangerous, because if you are relying on your client's progress to demonstrate the proof of your how good of a therapist you are, that you are a therapist who is competent. If that's what you're relying on, then when you mess up, or just when something simply doesn't work for your client, uh, you you can't cope with that. You don't have a way of holding it together, because suddenly you're being faced with, I'm not doing it right. I'm not a good therapist. And that's why I feel like you can't. It's so dangerous. Imposter syndrome, I think, is dangerous for a therapist to be in the room. I think it's so important for a therapist to have the ability to hear a client say, this isn't working for me, and for the therapist to not take that personally, for the therapist to hear, okay, that didn't work, not you're bad, that didn't work, let's find something else.
Yeah, and I know from my experience in my program that a lot of therapists in training definitely contend with this imposter syndrome, with shame that's been mentioned. And yeah, I'm wondering what sort of ideas you two have. I mean, this could be helpful for people who are listening who aren't therapists as well, who are consulting therapists, because I think that experience of shame in relationships, oh, I did something wrong, I'm bad, I'm not enough, is so common. As that comes up in the therapeutic relationship with therapists, what sort of ideas do you have for contending with that?
Next.
I know Carrie could talk about this forever, so I'll keep mine short because I think what she has to say is way more impactful. I think if you have imposter syndrome, it's a good thing, provided that you are open to the fact that you have imposter syndrome, because that means somewhere within yourself, you are aware that you have room to grow, right? And so if you have imposter syndrome and you mask it or try and like get as many compliments from your professors and your friends and Facebook groups as possible to reinforce that no, you're actually a really good therapist who knows what you're doing, that seems harmful, because then you're ignoring the parts of you that are very honestly saying, we're not as good as we think, and this is where we can get better. So imposter syndrome, I think, is great if you're able to sort of withstand that initial wave of shame and be curious about it and say, okay, so what are the things that I am deficient at as a therapist? Because we all have room for growth, and then do things to get better. That is a wonderful gift, to be able to check in with yourself and recognize where you feel like you're not good enough. It's when it becomes debilitating and you need to just squash it because it's too unsettling, that I think it shows up in sessions with clients in the form of defensiveness, in the form of being closed off because you don't have a container to hold the message that you're not good enough. Because as a therapist, with certain clients, we will all be not good enough. Carrie, tell me why I'm wrong.
No, it's not that you're wrong. It's not that you're wrong at all. I think actually, because this has been an ongoing conversation between the two of us, and I think actually we have, at the heart of it is a semantic difference, because I think that the definition, I personally think the definition of imposter syndrome is that you feel like you don't know what you're doing, but you're afraid that you're going to be found out to not know what you're doing. And so you need to maintain this facade of, I know what I'm doing. And I actually, this is why, there's a difference, I think, between what Ben is talking about and imposter syndrome. I think imposter syndrome is just this crippling fear that you're going to be found out. What Ben is talking about in terms of having a healthy awareness of, when you are not good enough, of being sad or upset that you are not good enough, having a negative feeling to you not knowing enough. I think I agree with that. I think that's healthy. I think that drives us, right? But I think the difference is like, so Ben referenced earlier, I feel no imposter syndrome as a therapist whatsoever. And I think I want to start by saying, like, if I right now was granted a white coat and was called a cardiovascular surgeon, and everyone thought I was a cardiovascular surgeon, I think I would have a lot of imposter syndrome, because the truth is I don't know how to do a bypass surgery. And I know that's a thing that's out there that can be done, and there are people who can do it very well. I don't know the first thing about it. So if I was calling myself a cardiovascular surgeon and didn't know how to do that, then I think absolutely I would feel imposter syndrome. Therapy, and this is what I found so validating about reading The Heart and Soul of Change, and the whole common factors approach, is that the truth is we don't yet know. There is no bypass surgery in therapy. There is no, like, absolutely accurate, this tried and true way of fixing anything for anybody. It is not, it's not like that. And so the truth is nobody knows. So if nobody knows how to do everything right, it's okay that you don't know how to do everything right. um, and that's what I feel like. No one is expecting you to know how to do everything right. Maybe your clients are, because they've been sold this cultural story that therapists are just like doctors or auto mechanics or whatever, and you go into the office and you come out fixed. I think that's up to us as advocates for the field to explain that isn't actually the truth. We've done I think a bad job as a field in trying over the past however many decades aligning ourselves with the medical model in hopes of bolstering our profession. But now we find ourselves in this position where we got what we wanted, and people think we are brain doctors and or mind doctors or wellness doctors, and we aren't. It's a different thing. We know it works, but we know it's not exactly the story that our clients are sold from a cultural standpoint. And so I think we as a field have a responsibility to change that public perception. I think that we have a responsibility to talk about therapy in public to lay people in plain language, because they need to know what it is they're walking into the room and getting. And we as therapists need to be okay with the fact that we don't know how to do therapy surgery. There are always things for us to learn. And if you feel like there isn't, if you feel like you've been practicing long enough or you've gotten enough certifications that you know everything, you're probably wrong. But if you are going into the room feeling like, I don't know what's going to happen on the other side of that door, you're right. You don't. And there's no way for you to know that ahead of time. And that's okay.
Absolutely. And yeah, I'm just reminded of my conversation with Scott Miller and conversations with a lot of other clinicians who I really admire, is that even after decades and decades of experience, they're still they're still on their toes, you know. There's still circumstances that they're not exactly certain how to navigate, and that's I think so important to hold on to, and then goes hand in hand with that, making sure we center our clients' experiences of therapy with us and are eliciting that feedback from them of how therapy is going.
Yes, Scott Miller, I think, said it as therapy is a series. He sees his own therapy practice as a series of mistakes. And for me, that's so liberating.
Yeah,
If Scott Miller feels that way, I, as a trainee, as an associate, as a learning pre-licensed therapist, I can feel that way also, and it's okay.
That's good. I think that's been my experience as well, Carrie, as a therapist in training. Is I think that was a big thing that drew me to Scott Miller's work as well. Was like it's okay to make mistakes, and it can actually be therapeutic for the client if I'm acknowledging these mistakes and checking in with them. So, yeah, I'm wondering if there's anything else that you two would like to share, maybe learnings in very bad therapy, or anything that you think would be really important to get out there.
It's funny. I have so much to say, and yet in being asked this question, I have no idea what to say. Gosh, I don't know, Carrie. What comes up for you?
What comes up for me was I was waiting to hear what you were going to say.
So we're both stalling for time here.
Yeah.
Or maybe I really like Chris Hoff at the end of his podcast. He often asks, is there anything that's really been catching your attention these days? Anything that has really been exciting you within the realms of psychotherapy or not?
For me, it's definitely I am super on a imposter syndrome kick, and actually the other thing that I've been on a kick about lately is I'm working on my final project for my graduate program, and a lot of the literature that I've been reading lately has to do with expectations, client expectations of treatment. And the various what that means, the construct is defined in multiple ways, and they get increasingly granular. So everything from the what the client expects therapy to be versus what the client hopes therapy to be, or what the client wants therapy to be. I think that what the client comes into the room thinking therapy is about is overlooked in training. We skip over that. We start with this intake and assessment, and then we launch into early goals, mid-phase treatment goals, late-phase treatment goals, I think we skip over this part where every person, every client has, again, it's a cultural story. It's maybe based on their prior experiences in therapy, based on what they've seen on TV about therapists. But something happened for a client who went through life up to a certain point and then decided they need therapy. And what that means, I think, for every client is different. And I think we need to get a lot more curious about what that means for that client. Why therapy? What was it about a therapist they think can help with, as opposed to a friend, a neighbor, a general practitioner, doctor? And when they finally decided to come to therapy, how are they feeling about this? Are they excited that they have finally found someone that they can talk to? Are they just so depressed about the idea of it because this is rock bottom, and if they haven't been able to fix it themselves, now they're here in therapy? What do they expect out of the process? What do they expect their therapist to be like, to do for them? Not that I'm saying we need to assess all of this to then match those expectations, but that's the starting gate. And figuring out what they walked into the room with so that you can then either explain, well, I can't offer that, here's how I'm different.
Sure.
Or modifying your treatment, modifying your approach. Okay, they want something that looks a lot more like life coaching. Cool. Do that with them if that's what they want, rather than forcing them to go through their childhood experiences and attachment issues if that's not what they want. I think that's it's something that has been really fascinating me lately. So.
Well, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Thanks for buying me time, Carrie.
You're welcome, Ben.
For whatever reason, what pops into my head is actually advice for anybody listening who's either getting started or in the middle of the graduate program in becoming a therapist. I think the majority of what you learn in grad school is just to get through grad school. And if there are ideas or small slices within the bigger pie that is psychotherapy that excite you, just spend as little time as possible to get the grades you want, to whatever is required of you in the program. Spend as little time as possible on the things that don't excite you. Spend as much time as possible on those little individual pockets of the field that really do excite you. Because I think being a therapist is amazing. I think it is especially amazing when you get to do it in a way that sort of orients with your worldview and what you're passionate about. Mm-hmm. So dive in head first. If you have the time and the resources, dive in head first to those things that excite you outside of your program. If you can connect with other people who share that enthusiasm, do so. And it's not just other people at the same stage of their journey as you are. One of the things that has been so illuminating and amazing for me in doing this podcast, and even before I did this podcast, was just reaching out to the people who I admire in this field, who have PhDs and decades of experience writing the coolest books and the coolest studies, thinking they will never even respond to me. And most of the time getting a response, and often developing relationships with those people that have blossomed into now collaborating on research or external projects within the field that are incredibly exciting. And the worst that happens is you just don't get a response. But it is so amazing to realize that if you are passionate about something in this field, there are other people who share that passion. And therapists care about people. They care about other therapists, and they want to form these connections. And I just think that's so amazing that within this field, if you love something, you can just turn it into, part of your career. That's just so cool to me.
Oh, I love that. And it just reminded me of one of my favorite instructors, Dr. Vargas. He in class with him, when he'd give us assignments and papers, he would say, "All right, guys, make sure this is going to be valuable for you. Make sure you're studying what you're interested in within the parameters of this." He's like, that's the focus. So yeah, connecting with what you're passionate about. I love that. And yeah, coming to the end of the interview here, the question I like to pose at the end is, what's a message of hope you'd like to leave the listeners with?
You're already a good therapist. I mean, you already are probably as good as a Zimbabwean granny on a bench. That's hat tip to Ben for that. It's one of my favorite episodes. But the reality is, I think my message of hope is that what I would want every therapist to know is that nobody actually knows what they're doing in terms of assigning, like, that these are competencies that a therapist should fulfill. These are classes you must take. These are certifications that you must get. Nobody actually knows that those have such a magnitude of impact on clients that's like super obvious, and you need to do it that way. You are already really great at connecting with the people that you're going to be good at connecting with. The rest of it is a lot of learning, and it's awesome, and never stop learning. But don't go into this like feeling, oh my God, like I know I'm not good at this yet. I wonder when I'll be good at it.
Now I'm self-conscious because my message of hope was like looking out to the cosmos, just big picture stuff. Because I mean, we're recording this.
Give me that hope. I want to know that hope.
We're recording this on November 11th, right? The pandemic is raging. Trump is undermining our democracy, and the country is becoming increasingly polarized with every passing day. And it is not unrealistic to think that, the logical conclusion of where we're headed is some kind of either civil war or climate change disaster where existential crises abound, right? That is all true.
Hope. You are not.
But I think so many of us are carrying that energy. It's that the allostatic load of the stress and the anxiety that's in the air, because this is not normal. We are living in unparalleled, fucked up times. And yet, the fact that we exist, the fact that we are alive, the fact that we have consciousness as human beings and can connect with one another and love one another is amazing. So while I think it's so easy to focus on everything in the world that is horrible, and certainly social media and the news does a really good job of reminding us every second of every day how fucked up things are, and that is true. But also, it is a miracle that we are just simply living, breathing creatures who can connect with one another. And there is beauty in the world, and there is love in the world. And I promise that I am not high right now. This is just what came up when you were talking about hope, because I think for a lot of people, understandably, hope feels very elusive at the moment because of everything that's happening in the world. But still, there's a lot of good. And I think there's hope in that forever and always.
Thank you. And
I was trying not to laugh.
No, I'm not. I'm thinking, and also there's sandwiches. So that's good. I think that's as good a reason as any to be alive. So.
Oh, that's good. So if people want to connect with you too, where's the best place to direct them?
Our website. Go ahead. You go.
Yeah. Our website is verybadtherapy.com. You can email us at vbtpodcast@gmail.com. And you can find more information about not only our podcast, but also our professional services, in case you are at all curious about that as well.
And do you want to just let people know what your professional services are?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, I am still in school, so I can offer no professional services at this time. But Ben is in a different situation.
Yes, I am an associate marriage and family therapist in the state of California, so I can provide therapy to anybody online within the state of California. I specialize in working with young professionals and entrepreneurs struggling with things like burnout and a general lack of fulfillment in life. And because this technically counts as an advertisement for my therapy services, so I don't get in trouble with the state regulatory board, I will just add that I am supervised by Kurt Widholm, licensed marriage and family therapist, number 47333.
Oh my God,
Thanks,
you
Andrew.
have that memorized?
Nice.
Well, I don't want to get like a sternly worded letter because I have violated some protocol.
I'm
That
turning you
makes
into the
sense.
BBS, absolutely.
Well, thank you, G, for being on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thank you
Thanks,
so
Andrew.
much for having us. This is a great conversation.
Please press the subscribe button, as well as rating and reviewing our podcast. This helps others connect with what you've been hearing. If you have any questions, please contact us at themindofatherapist@gmail.com. These questions will be kept anonymous. I want to thank Eric Price for the wonderful music you hear in this podcast. Additionally, this podcast was created to provide accurate and authoritative information on the subject matter. Although we are interviewing licensed therapists, they are not your therapists. This podcast is not intended to serve as direct medical advice and should not be used as a substitute for direct professional help. It is given with understanding that neither the host, publisher, guests, or PCS are rendering legal, clinical, or other professional information. If you need a professional, we encourage you to find one. Visit Psychology Today to connect with a licensed clinician near you.